Hello, and welcome to our panel on the U.S. election, co-organized by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the UBC Political Science Department, and the Canadian International Council, Vancouver chapter. My name is Nicolas Jensen. I'm a graduate student in the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the SPPGA. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on which Vancouver residents live, work, and study. A quick few housekeeping notes for our session today, which you'll see in the chat. Please note that we are recording this session and will be posting the video on our website. We are leaving the chat open, and activity in the chat will not be recorded. Please direct your questions to our Q&A moderator, Rebecca Moderat, who will either call on you to unmute yourself and state your question, or she can state it on your behalf, depending on what you would like to do. Please be mindful and respectful during the session and in the chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, Megan Diaz. Megan is a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. She's interested in questions around immigration, multiculturalism, and how we live and govern together in diverse democracies. Megan did her MA in political science at UBC. She's worked with the Institute for Future Legislators since 2017. In 2019, she helped bring the Institute to Toronto and has worked as the program coordinator for the IFL at the Ryerson University since. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Nicolas. So I'm really thrilled to be here today. As Nicolas mentioned, I am a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, but I recently came back to Vancouver partially to escape the COVID numbers in Texas, but also partially to hide from kind of the election madness. But here we still are, can't fully escape. And I'm really happy to be here with this wonderful group of scholars today who can kind of help us work through what happened tonight or last night and what to look forward to going forward. So today we are joined by Kristen Hopewell. Kristen is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Policy at the School of Public Policy and Global Governance at UBC. Her research specializes in international trade, global governance, industrial policy and development, with a focus on emerging powers. Dr. Hopewell has written 2 books on global economic issues, and her policy writings have been featured in various major magazines and newspapers. We're also joined by Robert Russo. Robert Russo is a faculty lead lecturer for the LLMCL program at the Peter A. Allard School of Law. Dr. Russo's interests in law include human rights, labor, and justice issues. His research has been primarily in the area of immigration and labor/employment law, and he has published several peer-reviewed articles in the field. He is an active member of the local legal community and a member of the Law Society of British Columbia. We're also joined by Matthew Wright. Dr. Wright is an assistant professor of political science at UBC. His research explores both political identities and core values and how they influence people's attitudes about immigrants, immigration policy, and diversity more general. Dr. Wright's work has appeared in various political science journals and publications. His latest book, Immigration and the American Ethos, further explores these subjects. So we're going to start off the panel today by getting a few thoughts from our panelists. Then I'll pose some questions to them. And in the final 15 minutes or so, we're going to open it up for questions from our audience. And if you do have a question that you want to pose to the panelists, please be sure to message Becca through the direct message in the Zoom chat. So since this panel is happening today, the day after the election, and as we're still kind of sorting through what's happening, and as many of us probably didn't get very much sleep last night, I wanted to start off by asking our panelists to kind of give us their headline for last night. So if you were writing a headline of what happened or what you think we should think about going forward, what would that headline be and why? And we're going to start with Rob and then move to Matt and Kristen.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Megan. My headline, I gave some thought to it, but I guess the headline I came up with is after the excuse me for that. After the voters follow the lawyers, or after the voters come the lawyers. And I mean, you don't have to look far to see where at least if anyone was up at 2 a.m. last night, Pacific time, and saw President Trump's short remarks, what you could make of them was that he first said that obviously called the election fraudulent, said that he'd won even before all the votes were counted, the vote counting should stop, and that he was going to go straight to the U.S. Supreme Court. First, I mean, there is no ability or leave to appeal to go straight to the U.S. Supreme Court, so it's not clear exactly what President Trump was talking about. But I think what he was trying to refer to were challenges in various states. And because the U.S. election is not really it's not a national election in the legal sense, as there's 50 states with 50 different state laws, and 50 different ways of deadlines, for example, of votes coming in and different methods of voting for each state that are considered legally acceptable. Just to give you an example, the deadline for returning mail ballots in some key battleground states was the election day and have to be received by the election day in Arizona, Florida, and then Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. The reason Florida, and to a certain extent Arizona, are a little bit faster in counting their ballots was that there was a little bit more leeway, especially in Florida, for counting mail-in ballots before election day. So Florida was able to build up this huge count, put it aside, and then release those on election day. For those of you who were watching yesterday, that was the expected Democratic advantage in mail-in votes. You saw it in Florida because those votes came in first. The problem, though, is that the legislatures in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, three of the most closely contested states, particularly the Republican Party in those states, refused to allow, for various reasons, mail-in votes to be counted before election day. So that's what's causing the delay now. So this isn't unexpected. I think for those of us who were watching it closely, everyone was expecting this to happen. The problem is the narrative that's being driven now, if we're not careful, from the White House, and in particular, I think from some elements too in the media, can lead people to say, well, why is this still continuing when this is a normal legal process in the United States? So if I had to sum it up, I would just say that the process is working, just let it work. And so far, there were very few disruptions on election day that I saw, which is a good thing. And we'll know the answer probably sooner rather than later, I hope. But there's some other issues too that we can talk about later on.
Thanks so much, Rob. Can I follow up quickly? Do you have a sense of when you expect us to know the results?
It depends on, well, we'll know, I think Pennsylvania announced that their count would be finished by Friday at the latest, I think. And I think the Secretary of State was also saying that by Thursday they might be done. So it's possible that, and I think Wisconsin was just called today, and if Michigan may take a little while, but depending upon the size of the whichever candidate is leading and how much vote is left, we might know Michigan potentially by later today or tomorrow. And it also depends on the remaining votes in Nevada. If that, currently I think Joe Biden is leading by about 8,000 votes. If that margin widens, there will still be legal options in terms of litigation to challenge the veracity of certain votes, recounts. But I think you'll have a pretty good idea who the winner is and a large consensus probably by tomorrow or the end of the week. But again, it depends on how those outstanding votes come in.
Okay, thank you so much. Matthew, let's go to you with your kind of headline and reactions from last night.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Megan, for this, and thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it. Just as a caveat, I don't know that much more than you guys about all this, so this is all in the spirit of speculation. I would say that my main headline would be slightly tongue-in-cheek. Most likely outcome occurs, Democrats devastated. So what do we know, right? Well, we know that so what do we know that we probably, if we were, thinking we already knew before it happened, right? Biden's going to win the popular vote by millions. The Electoral College structurally favors Republicans. States that were reaches for the Democrats, even heading in, states like Ohio and Florida and Texas, the Dems were really bullish about, mostly went for Trump. Georgia is still, we don't know yet. Biden is probably going to win most, if not all, of the sort of blue firewall states that Hillary needed and didn't win. Now I'm getting into a little bit more speculation. Biden seems to have underperformed, according to some of the exit poll data I've seen, with non-white voters, Blacks and Latinos especially. One thing that I saw, one sort of semi-reliable source had it that he's captured a larger source of the non-white presidential vote than any Republican since like 1960, which is amazing. So there's that. Biden seems to have underperformed a little bit versus expectations, I think, or versus some people's expectations with white women. And on the flip side, Trump seems to have sort of his support among whites, especially non-college educated whites, remains pretty strong, even if it's not quite strong enough to put him over the edge in places like Wisconsin or Michigan. The last thing I would say is Trump claims victory based on no solid real evidence. We kind of knew that going in. He's been telegraphing that for months. So what I want to say just a little bit more, and then I'm sure we'll talk more about it, is to sort of reflect, and this is all very sort of speculative. I don't, like I said, a lot of caveats here, but to think about, how Democrats are thinking about this, that I've seen, especially Democrats, and especially the disappointment that it wasn't like more of a rout than it was, more of a stronger repudiation of Trump. And what I would ask you to do is sort of consider the reference point for that judgment, and the reference point that a lot of these people are using. One is this sort of hopes and dreams thing, like, well, Trump is, terrible, Trumpism is terrible, so let's have an enormous win to just sort of repudiate everything. And there's been a lot of sort of good feelings happening, over the past few months on the Democratic side, especially, and there's also been a lot of despondency among Republicans. So, that was building, right? So, last night's outcome seems bad against that. It also seems bad, a little bit more interestingly, against estimates that have been made based on polls, state level polls, and polling aggregates like 538 and so on. They seem to have once again, like they did in 2016, sort of underestimated at the state level a lot of Trump support, overestimated Democrats. That's another reference point, and I think that's the main source of like Democrats' despondency. Third one is, well, what happened in 2016, right? And so far, I mean, the outcome looks to be more favorable to Democrats than it was in 2016. I guess I'm safe saying that because in 2016 we knew night of that Hillary wasn't going to win. So Biden looks like he's going to flip a couple of states, might even flip Georgia if he gets a break there. Arizona, I'm not sure, is a little bit tenuous, but it looks like he's going to get Arizona. So versus 2016, Biden is looks like favored to win at this point, even if he's not going to have a majority in the Senate. So there, Democrats can afford to be a little bit more happy about things. I want to say a word or two about polling. Everything I've seen so far, and again, the data's coming in, right? So who knows? But it seems to me like we're still fairly good at polling at the national level. At least we're within polling error, right? Where we're still apparently terrible, and possibly even more terrible than we were in 2016, is at the state and district level. So the average state polling error looks like something like 7 points roughly in favor of Trump versus 5 points last time around. There are two major sources of error that we can think about. One is this sort of shy Trump voter phenomenon, which a lot of people have talked about, which would be essentially people getting on the phone or whatever to answer a survey and not being willing to admit that they support Trump, even though they actually do, for all kinds of like social desirability reasons. The other source of polling error would be compositional error and representativeness, right? So like, are we getting the right people into our samples? So both of these things are in play, and we're going to be sort of taking these things apart for a long time to see what's really happened. Polling is not looking good generally today, so there's going to be a lot of searching about what we make of all of this. I would say a couple things. I would say that firstly, it doesn't seem to be all about Trump. The one that jumped out at me was that Susan Collins way overperformed her polls. I think in the last year, I don't think she's been ahead in a single poll and managed to win. And she wasn't one of these people that was like hyper identified with Trump in any way. The other thing, so it's maybe about Trump to some degree, but it's not, it's not uniquely about Trump. The other thing is that I would say is it's not easy to fix polling. If we want to sort of, put pollsters, hang them out in the stocks and tar and feather them, fine. it's not hard. It's not easy to fix it, and especially at the state level, because on a good day, a given poll gets like 5 or 10% of its target responses, and so there are always going to be questions about how to weight these respondents to achieve broad representativeness among the electorate. And what I always say to my stat students is, you don't know the answers to these questions. If you knew the answers to how exactly the weighting ought to look, you wouldn't need to run the survey in the first place, right? So we're always going to have to take guesses about what the electorate's going to look like. And those guesses, a lot of the time, are going to be wrong, and they're going to be wrong for systematic reasons. Last thing I'll say for now is that there's going to be lots of time to challenge and criticize and, Nate Silver and all these guys once all the votes are in. Meanwhile, I'd sort of encourage people to worry less about how the failures of polling and how polling has ruined everything and whatever, and think more about the country that we're trying to understand. What is actually underpinning Trump's and the Republican sort of strong support. This seems to me to be a more interesting and fruitful sort of topic of discussion. Like, why is, I was saying to people, this is editorial, I guess we're not supposed to take strong editorial positions here, right? But like, I can't imagine the Republican Party fielding a worse presidential candidate in 2020 than he did. And yet the fact that he's done as well as he has for structural reasons, for compositional reasons, all this stuff, that's something we need to talk about. And it's not just, polling is bad. All right, so I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. A lot to work through there, and I think a lot of those kind of themes and topics are going to come up in the discussion later. Kristen, what was your headline last night?
Thanks, Megan. So I'm going to sort of shift gears to the global level and specifically trade, the area that I work on. So my headline would be, with election results undecided, the future of the liberal trading order hangs in the balance. There's a strong sense that the world was watching the elections in the US last night and is eagerly awaiting the outcome, with the sense that this is going to have big implications for the future of the liberal international economic order. So, we know Trump has wreaked havoc on the multilateral trading system. Prior to Trump, the US had spent the past 70 years as a leader in constructing this liberal trading order, centered on institutions like the WTO that was based on multilateralism, international cooperation, the rule of law. And Trump has waged this, sustained massive assault on that system. With Trump, imposing tariffs on all of the US's major trading partners, launching major trade wars, threatening to withdraw from the WTO, threatening to withdraw from other trade agreements, regional trade agreements like NAFTA, in order to pressure countries like Canada into making additional concessions to the US. And also, most recently, in addition to blocking appointments to the WTO's appellate body and jeopardizing the system for settling trade disputes among states, he's also been blocking the appointment of the new Director General of the WTO. So there's, the world has been watching this with a strong sense that Trump is this very destructive, damaging force in the trading system. We've seen Trump really try to weaponize trade, to use it as a tool of economic coercion, a way to bully other weaker states in order to get what the US wants. And so, in the realm of trade, the US has really been acting as a rogue state on the international stage. So there's been a sense that if Biden is to be elected, we can expect to see a major shift in US trade policy. Biden has signaled that he would be interested in recommitting the US to international institutions like the WTO, to principles of multilateralism, to abiding by the rule of law. And he's also signaled that he's interested in reinvesting in the US's traditional alliances, including with countries like Canada. So, the trade world has been watching this intensely to try to see what the results are going to be. And as I said, there's a strong sense that, institutions like the WTO, other international institutions, this liberal international economic order really hangs in the balance in terms of the outcome of the election. And shifting just for a second to sort of the domestic side of this, Trump's trade policies have all been falling under this rubric of his campaign to supposedly make America great again. But the irony, of course, is that these trade policies, Trump's tariffs, have actually been hurting the US economy, not helping it. Trump's tariffs have weakened the competitiveness of the US manufacturing sector. They've hurt US exports, with other trading partners imposing tariffs on the US in retaliation for its trade policies. They haven't led to the resurgence of manufacturing jobs in the US that Trump promised. In fact, it's been just the opposite. They've actually hurt manufacturing employment, and they haven't reduced the US trade deficit. So I think from a trade perspective, there's a sense that Trump's policies have been a resounding failure. And yet, despite all this, he's performed much better than many people from outside the US were expecting. So I'll leave it there and look forward to our questions and discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Yeah, we're gonna come back to questions of kind of how the whole world is watching and responding to this in a couple of minutes. So I have prepared kind of some questions based on things that I noticed last night. And I want to start off with a question specifically directed for Matthew, and that's on voter turnout. So voter turnout was kind of a big story in the lead up to the election in a lot of places, including my state of Texas. Turnout in just kind of the advanced polls surpassed even all the turnout in the 2016 general election. And we were seeing kind of a lot of people turn out who don't have high turnout rates in the past. So a lot of young people were voting, they were voting at record rates. I think that there is a sense that when there's higher turnout, it benefits the Democrats. At the same time, we also saw a lot of stories of kind of voter disenfranchisement, questions of, how are people going to vote? Are those votes going to count? And worries that that might suppress turnout. So my question is, what do you see the impact of voter turnout in the 2020 election? And kind of thinking forward, voter turnout broke records in 2018 too. And it also broke records among, young people were voting at higher rates, all of that. So are we seeing kind of the start of a new trend of higher turnout in the US and maybe turnout among people who didn't traditionally turn out?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. It's a good question. What I've seen so far is that turnout, turnout has been high, right? I won't speak to questions about the sort of issues of suppression and all of that, because that's not my area of expertise, especially. Yeah, I won't comment on Trump sort of trying to stop counting here and count more here and, do all that kind of stuff. Turnout has been high. Turnout has been disappointing in places like Texas, in sort of Latino communities and poorer communities. But again, like the reference point matters, right? Like what people are gonna have to be careful to do, and I don't have the data right now to sort of make a sound judgment about it, is, think about, well, not just what was turnout versus what we wanted it to be or what we hoped it would be versus what was turnout versus what it was in 2016. And I think the Democrats will have made gains everywhere. I think the one thing I can say sort of comfortably is that, if Biden manages to pull out the win, which it looks like he will at this point, then essentially it doesn't seem like Trump's people are turning out less. And if anything, they've turned out more in most places. So Democrats have made some gains on turnout too, just mathematically. And in places like, Wisconsin and Michigan, and not by a huge amount, but just enough to sort of take what was a small edge to the Republicans in 2016 to, a small edge to the Democrats. And a lot of that is just, there are a million things that make the race in 2020 different than the race in 2016. But so it's hard to say, well, what is it that did it? It's hard to think that spending God knows how many billions of dollars to turn people out hasn't had any effect. So I think that's a big part of it. Now, the bigger question, which is what will this look like in the future? I think you're right to sort of frame it in terms of, okay, 2016 was relatively low turnout, right? And then 2018, very high turnout. 2020 looks like it's going to be a high turnout race. What happens moving forward? A couple of things are, just in the sort of, broad view, we know a couple of things. We know that partisanship and polarization aren't going anywhere. And in all of the eras of American political history that have been highly polarized, they've been characterized by high turnout for reasons that are fairly, intuitive, right? When people perceive that, the winner of the election really matters and that something is at stake, which is to say not, 2000 or 1996 or whatever, right? Years where, there's a real difference between the parties and people are really mobilized, you're going to have high turnout. So in that sense, the high turnout is maybe is a symptom of something bad, which is a sort of excessive polarization. But nevertheless, right, it's there. And since the polarization is not going anywhere, and it may only get worse, then the turnout will continue to stay high. The other thing I would add to that is that we know that turnout is a habit. Excuse me, at the individual level, right? The turnout is a habit, and once you've voted one time, your likelihood of voting another time is incredibly high, right? So what we're doing right now is we're locking in new voters, you know, who are 18 years old, 19, 20, whatever, early 20s, young people who are voting now at a time, who are first experiencing politics now at a time when they're most likely, when it's most likely to matter for them, and then they're locking in patterns of behavior that are going to persist throughout their, you know, throughout their lifetimes. That matters both in terms of what their political views are and what parties they identify with, and it matters in terms of their propensity to actually show up. So my answer to the bigger picture question, and you know, which I'm much more comfortable with an answer of like, well, you know, who's showing up at what precinct, you know, yesterday, or with mail, or with all this other stuff, is that we're going into a high turnout era, and that's not an unqualified good, but it's certainly a good for those of us who like to argue that, well, democracy is improved when more people sort of show up to vote.
Yeah, thank you. I'm heartened to hear that you see kind of turnout increasing over time. Obviously, one of the things that, you know, people turn out when they see the higher stakes, and that also means that their votes have to be counted. And so that's kind of the question, I guess, that's still remaining and that I want to ask Rob about. So you kind of talked about this in your opening remarks, but you know, last night and in tweets this morning, we're seeing the president question the legitimacy of mail-in ballots, saying, you know, stop counting all the votes together, and talking a lot about we're going to go to court. And then, you know, we're also seeing the Biden team saying we're going to ensure that every vote is counted and we're going to go to court if necessary. So what does that process actually look like? How does it start? Does it just start with a recount and then move on to something else? And you mentioned, you know, there's not a direct path to the Supreme Court, but is there any path to the Supreme Court? Because I know that came up a lot in the recent confirmation hearings.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Well, first, in terms of what that looks like, they've already filed, I mean, challenges, I have my litigation tracker open, so I'm following the challenges as they're being submitted even today. But yesterday, for example, I had Nevada, 2 complaints were filed by the Trump campaign. One of them was seeking an order in Clark County to keep one of the polling places open for in-person voting an extra hour because of some technical difficulties with software. There was another complaint filed earlier that is still pending appeal to dismiss or to dismiss certain mail-in votes that are not counted in a certain way, or verification procedures not followed in a certain way. So what the process looks like is it differs state by state depending upon what the particular issue is. And, you know, I'm assuming, let's say, that most of the litigation now probably will be launched by the Trump campaign or allied groups if they seem to be losing certain states or need certain states. So for example, Nevada and Pennsylvania, if they were to lose Pennsylvania, Nevada is an interesting case because it wasn't as much of a focus. There was a lot of political focus, I think, on Nevada. I think the Trump campaign thought they had a chance there, and that there was a lot of, you know, maybe the Biden campaign could have done some different things in terms of organizing. I'm not quite sure, but it's closer, a lot closer than it should have been. So I think it caught some people off guard in terms of some of the legal consequences, but it looks like the margin is widening now. So even if you have a recount, it probably wouldn't be enough to change the margin unless it shrinks really low. Then maybe Matthew could speak to that. But the Pennsylvania is the one to watch, because if that becomes pivotal, then there is a path for it to go to the Supreme Court in terms of challenging Pennsylvania's changes to mail-in voting. And the problem is that in Michigan and Wisconsin, you've had mail-in voting, but you've had it done in a way that was in accordance, let's say, with the legislation that was drafted or the limitations that was drafted by GOP-controlled legislatures at the time, or at least with the consensus. In Pennsylvania, it was a bit different because it was altered by the Secretary of State and the state government against what the state legislation had prescribed. So you had that challenge, I think, that became widely known. The case is actually called Bookvar, B-O-O-C-K-V-A-R. And it was an attempt to at least segregate all those votes that were coming in up to 3 days, that were received in Pennsylvania 3 days after Election Day, which was a change to Pennsylvania state law. So long as it was postmarked by Election Day, the changes that were made by the state government not the legislature in this case, authorized them because of COVID-19, the situation, to count those ballots coming in. And other states have that provision in state legislation, but Pennsylvania did not. And so it's a complex legal issue. They use the state constitutional provision to uphold it at the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. The interesting thing is that was appealed to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court basically punted, and I don't know if you remember that, but they took 2 weeks, I think, to initially decide it, which is a long time for an emergency motion at the Supreme Court. So it indicates to those of us who are watching it that there was some discussion and there was some back and forth, some speculation that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, was trying to get one of the other justices to come over because there was a deadlock. In the end, there was a deadlock, 4-4. You had the 3 Democratic appointed justices plus Justice Roberts declining to grant certiorari, at least in that case, and then or grant injunction, and then the 4 conservative justices, Alito, Kavanaugh, Thomas, and Gorsuch, were in favor of it. Then the Republican Party again tried for an order, this time of certiorari for judicial review, and this time it was denied with an opinion that was written by Alito and joined by Gorsuch and Thomas. Interestingly, Kavanaugh didn't join the opinion, although he voted originally with siding with the Republican Party's complaint. But if you read that opinion by Alito, it's pretty clear that they think that there's a good chance that those late votes in Pennsylvania, which could be a really big number, should be segregated, which Pennsylvania is doing. And if it did go to the Supreme Court, there's the strong likelihood that those votes could be then what the court termed to be segregated and an appropriate remedy applied in case it's found to be invalid. The remedy being those ballots would be disqualified. So that is a potentially, I think, really big issue. It may not come to that, depending upon how it works out in the electoral map, but that's something to watch, I think, in the next few days. By Thursday or Friday, I think we'll know once the rest of the map starts to fill out a bit more. But that, for me, I think, is the most likely path to go to the Supreme Court. And if that happens, then the original punting, Justice Barrett, although she was on the court, didn't participate in it. The reason is they gave, I think, a brief reason was she didn't have time, essentially, to study the issue, just in plain terms. Presumably, if it goes back, it will be a full court this time. So, and if then her vote could become pivotal. So that's in a nutshell, that's the issue.
Thank you. Just really quickly, you kind of alluded to a couple of times saying that you hope it doesn't come to that it doesn't go to the Supreme Court. Yeah. Why is that?
Well, I think my hope before this election is I hoped it would be a decisive win, one way or another. My family lives in California. California has never been in doubt. California counts ballots for days, sometimes weeks after an election, just because it's huge and there's ballots arriving all the time. That's why the popular vote, Biden will win. I mean, I think he's ahead by 2.5. After all of California's counted, he'll win, I would expect, by at least 3 or more points. But the problem is these are issues that shouldn't be decided, I think, by the courts in the polarized environment we have in the United States. Like, this isn't Canada. It's not the Supreme Court of Canada. Even when we did, I've looked at the Clarity Act when the Supreme Court of Canada was discussing Quebec and sovereignty and independence. And they took a very, very balanced, very judicial view. Politics, at least didn't enter into it. That isn't the case in the United States. No matter what the court decides, it'll be seen as a politicized decision. If it came down to that, where let's say Pennsylvania goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and those votes end up being invalidated 5-4 or 6-3 or whatever, and all the conservative justices vote to invalidate it, first it'll be seen as inherently, I think, not fair and not. What's the word I'm looking for is not necessarily justifying the democratic process. and the second point there is also that the fact that Barrett may be a pivotal vote would raise another issue in terms of bias and whether she should have recused herself. And then the third issue is that because of the actors involved, and I'm talking here about the president, if the court, let's say, were to rule against him, there's a real, I think he said that he's not going to accept it. Then, you know, already the ruling. So then where do you go after that? The next logical step is he starts to call for demonstrations or he starts to call for rallies. So I think it could lead to a lot of instability. So I hope it doesn't go down that road. And it's a road that'll take days, but once it starts snowballing, if anybody remembers Bush versus Gore, it was heading in that direction before finally it ended, you know, just before Christmas. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Kristen, let's move to other countries now. So as you said, you know, the whole world is watching, and there's been a lot of discussion about what the appropriate response from kind of other countries and other world leaders should be. So I know Justin Trudeau has kind of taken a more cautious approach, whereas maybe some opposition leaders in Canada, particularly Jagmeet Singh, are kind of more forceful in calling out the president. What are some of the reactions you've seen from other countries or other world leaders? And how are they preparing for the results of the election, kind of either way it goes? And might we, you know, expect to see any world leader comment on the process or the election if it becomes kind of a drawn out process that might go to court as Rob described?
I think most world leaders are similar to Trudeau, trying to play it safe and take a very cautious diplomatic approach to this in terms of reactions to the election and the uncertainty and the eventual outcome in the short term. I think in the longer term, though, what we've seen is, you know, countries have been mobilizing to try to respond to the Trump threat to the liberal international order, to institutions like the WTO. To give one example, at the WTO, for example, the European Union and Canada have been leading efforts to try to create, to try to respond to the appellate body crisis that's been created by Trump and Trump's policies within that institution. So Trump has blocked appointment of judges to the WTO appellate body, which effectively acts as a Supreme Court for global trade. It hears appeals of trade disputes, and it's critical to the functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. So it's a core of the rules-based trading system. And with that under threat from Trump and from the US, the European Union and Canada have come together and mobilized a group of states to create what's effectively an interim appeals mechanism of the WTO. It's come to be known as an appellate body minus the US. So we see examples of this where countries are coming together and they're trying to find workarounds to, you know, the sort of obstructionism that we're seeing from the US. They're trying to keep international institutions alive. They're trying to maintain a system of global order based on the rule of law, based on international cooperation, even with, you know, an American hegemon that's not only turned away from these institutions, but is actively trying to sabotage them. So the rest of the world isn't sitting idly by. They have been working to try to combat this threat. And right now there's a lot of, you know, many actors are sort of waiting in pause mode to see the results of the US election and to determine what steps needs to be taken next based on the anticipated results. There is a strong sense that if Biden is elected, we will see this major shift in the US approach to international institutions and multilateral cooperation. We will see the US recommitting to trying to work within these institutions to address some of its concerns about China, about the trading regime and so forth. So there's sort of a bit of a wait and hold until we find out the results.
Do you think, even if Biden does win, do you think it'll just kind of go back to the way it was in 2012 or 2016? Or has the world kind of figured out or become more wary of the US in a way that, you know, will impact things going forward?
It's a good question. I think there's, will the world go back to normal? I think there's a sense that we've seen, well, first of all, that Trump has done lasting damage to the US's international standing, its reputation on the international stage, its power and influence. It has done lasting damage to US credibility. Watching the US walk away from its international commitments, from international institutions, from treaties that it signed, from laws it's agreed to abide by, has done long-term damage to the US credibility. You know, why will countries, other states now trust that the US will abide by future commitments that it makes? So I think there are going to be long-term repercussions in that sense. Whether or not we've seen a shift in terms of US trade policy and US foreign policy remains to be seen. There is a sense, as I said, that Biden will recommit to multilateralism and to international cooperation. He has articulated very similar concerns to what we've seen from Trump in terms of China, for example. Biden too has expressed concerns about China's industrial subsidies, about its technology transfer policies, its violation of intellectual property rules. But rather than trying to address China's trade practices through things like the arbitrary use of tariffs and these other unilateral trade measures, Biden has signaled that he wants to work through institutions like the WTO to try to address China's trade practices, and also to work with like-minded states, with allies like the European Union, Japan, Canada, and so forth. So although there may be some continuity in terms of the big issues on the agenda, I think we would see a major change under Biden in terms of how the US goes about pursuing its objectives on the international stage.
Okay, thank you. So I want to turn to questions of kind of media coverage in the US. And this is open for whoever out of you three wants to answer it. And if everyone wants to give comments, very happy for that. So the media in 2016 was kind of subject to a lot of criticism of how they covered the campaign and the election. And we do know that several outlets did change their strategies this time. We saw them kind of taking different tactics. But there were still concerns over disinformation campaigns, concerns over the traditional media kind of calling races too quickly, specifically thinking of Fox calling Arizona arguably kind of early in the night. And then questions of how the media outlets would cover things like the president saying, we should stop counting ballots. And we did see some media outlets just switch away and no longer even air that speech. So what did you see as the role of media in this election, and what should we be looking forward in coverage going forward, especially if things get kind of dicey or legal as Rob described?
So I can speak to that for a second if you want. I would just say that this is all taking place in the context of a media environment that has gotten more and more factionalized is maybe not the right word, but people are in their bubbles. And so what really matters, I think that the polling, I think that everybody who's done polling, all the sort of reputed polling shops, all the networks or whatever are trying to do their best and are mostly reputable. The divide is not, or the problem is not with the news reporting. There's this sort of endemic issue of how do you deal with an eminently newsworthy thing, which is the president of the United States making a speech on election night where he just claims to have won. It's a real, the good news is we knew ahead of time, everybody knew ahead of time that he was going to do this because he'd said as much. But I have a lot of appreciation for how to handle, the difficulty of handling that challenge. And I think for the most part, the news, the serious news that I've seen has sort of handled it pretty well, even if they didn't, sort of immediately cut away when he started spewing nonsense. Now I've just heard that they've called, the Trump campaign has called Pennsylvania in their favor, so that's good. And so, what do you do with that, right? You have to cover it, but at the same time, you have to sort of contextualize it properly. Where I think the big problem is sort of that sort of conservative bubble that is the editorial side of Fox News, the editorial side of the of the Wall Street Journal. Never mind all of Facebook and right-wing Twitter and all of that. That's just gonna turn this into basic. It's just gonna echo Trump's grievances all over the place, and so that's where the real damage is going to be done. And it's not so much about who's the right winner. It's about undermining a massive tranche of the electorate's confidence in the process, which is just a huge threat, in my opinion. And that's something else. Just with reference to your question from earlier, that people who are just coming into the electorate now, they're going to be socialized with this, right? This is politics for them. It would be inconceivable if you told somebody who came of age, in 1956, that this kind of an election could ever happen in America, where one side is basically totally devoted to just a grab for power, essentially. So how is the media? I don't know. Look, I think the bigger problem is that everybody's in a bubble. And that especially viewers on the right tend to not be very, they tend to be sort of captive to Trump's own grievances and his own grievance politics. And there's no pushback there. Whereas I feel like the coverage elsewhere has been a lot more sort of reasonable under the circumstances.
Do you think that the kind of right-wing bubble is Fox News, or is it more a social media bubble at this point?
It's both. If you were to ask me, you didn't, but I'll ask myself the question. If you were to ask me, pick the two people who've damaged American democracy the most over the last 3 decades, I would say you know, Rupert Murdoch and, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, right? Probably. I'd have to think about it, but like right now, that's my answer. And so it's both of those things. Fox News, I mean, but I said there's a real distinction between the sort of editorial side of Fox News, which is enormously popular, right? So we can't discount that, like, this is, you know, the people like Trump, when he was listing off the other night, all of all of the Fox people that he liked, right? I mean, he was talking about Fox and Friends, he was talking about Tucker, he was talking about, you know, Hannity and, you know, all these people. These are all editorial, right? The news people like Chris Wallace and these guys, they were out there last night saying, like, Trump's saying he's won these states. He hasn't won these states. I believe they'll continue to do so, right? But people they lapse into this sort of editorial stuff. There's another threat too, which is the sort of OAN, you know, Breitbartian sort of side of the media landscape. And I don't have a good sense right now about who those people, I mean, I have a sense of who those people are, but like how prevalent, you know, somebody who's like somebody who gets all their news from OAN. I mean, I think that's probably pretty rare, but that's a major threat. But like social media, I mean, just bounces this stuff around to everybody. And it does so algorithmically because that's the way that Facebook has made money. And Twitter to a lesser extent and all of that. And so, and like they've tried, as you guys have all seen, right? They've tried to sort of, Twitter censored the president a bunch of times last night, basically. It was actually funny. He had like 5 or 6 tweets in a row that were just like censored by Twitter. And, you know, the point is, well, yeah, okay, so Twitter's censoring him, but like the lie gets around a lot faster, right? And it gets to certain types of people. So I'm really worried about it. I did read, you know, Kevin Russo at one point, the New York Times, was saying something like, if you'd only paid attention to Facebook over the past 6 months rather than, you know, 538, this election would make a lot more sense to you. And I'm not sure if I fully am on board with that statement, but it's definitely worth sort of thinking about.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just conscious of the time now, so I'm going to pose my final question I have, and then we're going to move to audience Q&A. So again, if you have something to ask, please direct that to Becca. So my final question is kind of regardless of what happens with the results and who, you know, becomes the president next, the current Congress is still in session. Trump is still the president until January 20th, 2021. And, you know, the US is dealing with rising COVID numbers. The recovery package is still under negotiation. The Paris Accord is, you know, coming up there. What do we expect to happen between now and January 20th, just in terms of, you know, these kind of policy decisions? And might we also expect Trump to, if he does lose this election, might we expect him to try to push forward a bunch of executive orders to try to get his agenda passed as much as possible in the next couple of months? So if Kristen or Rob want to take that. Or both, and one go first and one follow.
I can speak to a few. He'll try, I mean, in terms of executive orders, I would suspect there'd be a lot of pardons forthcoming. There was some speculation as to whether or not he would try to, or whether constitutionally there's actually the US president has the power to pardon him or herself. So he may attempt that. Certainly, I think that there will be, the Supreme Court is due to hear a case on the Affordable Care Act with, I think, Justice Barrett sitting on it that could pretty much gut, you know, what remains of the ACA before, if Biden assumes, you know, if Biden wins and assumes office in January. In terms of internationally, I'm not sure in terms of the Paris Accords. I think the US is due to withdraw. Kristen may have more to say on that, but it's due to withdraw shortly. I would expect if Biden wins and is inaugurated in January that he'll reverse that and he'll rejoin. Although I'm not sure whether or not it would have to go through the ratification process in terms of that or any other treaties that Trump has withdrawn from in the interval. Apart from that, I would expect that there would be a lot of legal maneuvering between now and January, and I honestly, it's just speculation at this point. With the way the COVID numbers in the U.S. are skyrocketing here, just anecdotally, when I was traveling, I have not seen airports this empty that I traveled through, and I traveled 2 of them recently in the United States. It's quite a different environment being here, even in California, than it is being back in Vancouver and in Canada. There's a sense here that that COVID is, the situation is serious and not getting any better. So in terms of the interval period, I would expect, though, that there would be a lot of maneuvering to protect himself, his family, and his associates between now and January while the court challenges drag on.
Thanks so much. Kristen?
Yeah, just to add to that on the trade side, a lot of the harm or the damage that Trump has done on trade has been through the use of executive authority. It's not measures that have gone through Congress. So I would imagine that we would likely see, if he loses the election, a flurry of activity potentially through executive orders on trade between now and the end of the year. On the Paris Accord, so the US formally withdrew today from the Paris Agreement that took effect today. If I recall correctly, that didn't go through Congress initially, so I would assume that Biden could rejoin that if he were elected, and that wouldn't require congressional approval. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Becca, are we ready to go to audience questions?
Yes, we have a really good question that I think is top of mind for everyone. I'm going to ask Emmett to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, there we go. Sorry for the delay. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for this really great event. I think I learned a lot. I think with the end of this election, I think that I kind of just lost a really great topic for small talk with my American friends, given that we should be knowing the results very soon. So the question I had was kind of, given there's this huge mismatch between what the polling data was suggesting and what actually happened. So I was wondering kind of the panelists' thoughts on if there was like a rally around the flag effect around kind of the Trump campaign or the Trump presidency, and to what extent there was, and if there was kind of a rally around the flag effect around the Republican campaign, how did that happen given kind of the really dismal economic and COVID-19 response in the last few months in American politics?
So I think, thanks for the question. It's one of those questions where I think I could answer in 75 different ways, none of which satisfactory. Like the issue, it really seems to me that, well, I'm losing my train of thought now. Well, this is embarrassing. Okay, I'm going to mute myself for a second. Oh wait, no, sorry, no, I know what I was going to say. So there's no data. We don't have the data, first of all, right? I don't think that there's. I mean, it would be really hard to come up with a test that we could answer today that would discriminate between, you know, what you suggest, which is a sort of rally around the flag effect, and beautiful voters and all of these people, sort of getting together to save America. I don't see a whole lot of evidence for that, but I can't rule it out either, versus something else, which is just that we're not polling people, we're not getting the right people into our sample. I don't see a whole lot of evidence, a whole lot of convincing evidence that people are shy about who they're supporting, although again, it's something else I can't quite rule out. What's been interesting to me is, well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how what kinds of messages played with what groups of voters. And so, these weird kinds of, seemingly weird kinds of findings, like, Florida basically goes for Trump, but also goes for a $15 minimum wage, which Biden supported and Trump was against. I mean, how do we sort of reckon these sorts of things? I wouldn't necessarily think about it as rallying around the flag, because usually the way that term is deployed is sort of in the wake of some sort of threat, some outside threat or catastrophe. What I do think happened for sure is that a lot of Republican partisans came home, and it's impossible to know the number. And it's impossible to say, okay, well, is it because a lot of Republicans were saying, oh, I'm not going to vote for, I'm going to go Biden this time, Trump is just not acceptable, versus versus just not, the people who are supporting Trump just not answering surveys or not being sampled properly. It's impossible to know, and it's going to take us a long time to figure it out. So yeah, again, this is not at all a satisfying answer, but we really don't know. I'm amazed that you're still looking at like this is a small talk opportunity. I feel like I'm pretty sick of talking about this election. Like, not to you guys, right? Of course, you guys are the exception, right? But I mean, like, thinking, okay, well, when I encounter Americans, I'm not sure I'm going to want to talk about this election necessarily, right? It's a little bit like, oh, okay. But anyway, no. So I think that I think that it's something to keep track of. there was no sign before the election that there was going to be this immense groundswell of support for the president. If anything, the race has been defined. I'll stop talking in a moment, but I'll just say, like, the way that my strongest feeling on this at this point, and I have lots of feelings pointing in slightly different directions, my strongest feeling about this is that this race has been static for 6 months, right? Trump's approval has not budged. There's been no sign over time. If you look at polls that are, repeated cross sections, you look at polls that are panels, there is no sign that that people have sort of changed their minds and flooded back to Trump, right? So that tells me that this has to be, to a larger degree, it has to be either people are lying consistently the whole time about whether they support him or not, or they're just consistently not, to the degree that the polls don't reflect final votes, that they're not sort of being sampled properly. So I think those two things are probably more likely than all of a sudden a massive sort of wave of things. But I mentioned media bubbles before, and I really want to be careful because I, like all of us, am in my own media bubble as well, right? So, like, I'm flipping around on Resistance Twitter and I'm like, oh my God, everybody's upset about this. But of course, not everybody's upset about it. Half the country is thrilled about it. So I want to be really cautious about that until some of the higher quality sort of academic surveys come out. And I think I've said enough at this point.
Okay, unless anyone else doesn't want to jump in, I'll move on to the next question from Nicolas, and this is a question about Senate races. The conversation around Trump polling error is understandable, such as the shy Trump voters. I will qualify that, though, with the fact that I think the shy Trump voter is supposed to be a myth. Questions about that. But what went wrong for the Democratic polling in relation to the Senate? Susan Collins, for example, or even Cal Cunningham. I'll pose that to any of you who wants to jump in.
I don't know if you guys also want to talk. I can speak more about this if you guys want, but otherwise I'm happy to let other people talk. I'm not seeing an overwhelming desire for other people to weigh in at this point.
I can just comment.
Yeah.
No, please.
No, I'll just comment for a second and then I'll turn it over. And this goes to the last question too. I think if I had to sum it up, I think voter suppression still works, unfortunately. In Georgia, if you look at the margins in Georgia and the Senate races in Georgia, and if you look at the margin in North Carolina, and I think Cunningham might be running ahead of Biden, I'm not sure, but it's close, 1 percentage point. Given the strict voter ID laws in place there, given the strict requirements for mail-in balloting, given some of the restrictions that particularly the GOP pursued in limiting ballot drop-off access during a pandemic, it's I think perfectly reasonable to argue that if the Senate candidates lose those races by about 40 or 50,000 votes, that those efforts actually paid off for the Republican Party and they maintained control of the Senate. So. And I mean, in Maine, I'm not quite sure what will happen in terms of whether Susan Collins pulls it off or not. But the other point I just wanted to make, and then I'll turn it over, is that I think the perception of Trump voters and how they view. I mean, I was amazed at one statistic that in Eastern Ohio, or Ohio in general, labor voters, rank and file labor voters, union members voted for Trump 55 to 44%, I think, majority of union members in Ohio and in Western Pennsylvania. And these were, unions that endorsed Biden from the leadership, but the membership just didn't. And this is actually, I think, improved his margins in a lot of those areas from 2016. But it goes to show in how they view, and I've looked at some of this in terms of how they view law and the rule of law, because I teach public law at Allard too, and the rule of law principle. They don't look at it in the way that probably non-Trump voters do. To them, the rule of law means restoring, making America great, restoring a country to a time when law to them meant preserving a social hierarchy, status, familiarity. A lot of it goes to do, and it goes hand in hand with this whole growing body of evidence. Then why do men, favor even across to African Americans necessarily, although some Hispanics who've been in the country for a long time, I think, fall into that category, Hispanic males particularly, is restoring a sense of order and a sense of familiarity to the country that they think they've lost. So I think the Trump campaign was really successful, and more than the polls captured in terms of tapping into that. and sort of like driving home the message that that Trump was the vehicle for doing that again and driving their turnout up.
So I agree with 90% of that, and the one thing I would maybe not be totally satisfied with an explanation to do with vote suppression, although that may have been happening, but like the sort of consistency of this phenomenon that we're seeing. Like, I mean, really, it was only what Mark Kelly won, and I forget who else, right? But like Lindsey Graham got reelected. McConnell was not shocking, right? But like the amount of money that went into these races, and like Collins, McConnell, Graham. I mean, these guys are winning comfortably, right? It's not close. It's not 10,000 votes here or there. And so like I think there's more to it than that, and I think more of it sort of traces to the polling. I don't have a strong conclusion at this point about where that error is coming from. In 2016, everybody looked to sort of like undersampling, rural, white, uneducated voters. Maybe that's true again this time. Again, if you're working from a 5% response rate and then sort of trying to gain representativeness, that there's a lot of question marks along the way. I generally agree with what Becca said about shy Trump voters being sort of like, it's one of those things. It's kind of like the Higgs boson was for years, right? It's probably there, but unprovable, right? At this point, like there's not a lot of data that favors it. The one thing I will say to push back, and like I have no data on this at all, right? But this is just my own hunch, right? Is that if you think about, and you guys can write me, you pro-Trump people in the audience, if there are any, can write me angry emails about how I'm misrepresenting everything. But like, if we think about what the shy Trump voter phenomenon is, theoretically, right? What it is people looking at a president who's behaving in, let's just say, reprehensible fashion, or at least I'll say it more diplomatically, right? Non-socially desirable against social desirability. It's such that people would want to conceal their support for that person. Now, if that's our definition, there's no real evidence that there was strong, shy Trump voting, not decisive shy Trump voting in the United States in 2016 in virtually anywhere that I've seen. This year, I mean, things got really nasty just in the past month, right? So if these people were ever going to emerge and just be shy about, in the past month or two, if you think of it, I mean, these COVID rallies have gone on constantly. Trump is basically just insulting Jay-Z and, doing various stuff. Like, if you guys watch these rallies, I mean, it's amazing, right? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, like, there's no platform. It's just spewing out grievances and whatever. And like, so all of the things that people claim to be bothered by, and I realize I'm way out on a ledge here, right? But all the things that people claim to be bothered by about Trump, right? Even Republicans, they don't like the tweeting, they don't like the bad behavior, they don't like, whatever. I mean, all of that is just massively amped up. So I wouldn't rule it out that we find more of that in 2020 than we did in 2016. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is it's just really hard to poll the kinds of people that Trump supports. It's really, that support Trump. This is true in terms of the sort of so-called white working class. It's also true in terms of like, the Latino community in Florida and other places. I mean, it's not just that we don't know, we don't understand them. It's just that they're hard to find, they're hard to get into samples, and so we don't represent them well in surveys. I think that's mainly the issue.
Thanks, Matt. I'm just concerned about time. I see we've gone over just a little bit. I want to hand it over to Jerry now to close off, and a word of thanks.
Yeah, so not much for me to say. We are over time, but I want to thank Kristen and Rob and Matt for their time. I want to thank Megan for moderating the session. Thank our partners through the SPPGA and Political Science and the Canadian International Council, to the staff and volunteers. So Rebecca and Catalina from CSDI, Tatiana at CIC, Lindsay, Tina, Joelle, and Nicolas from School of Public Policy, and Brent from Political Science. And because we kept this tight, we know that there's more to see and more to talk about. So we want you to ask you to join us for 2 more events that are left in this series. November 13th is a session co-sponsored with CIC on the global implications of this, and November 19th will be our last kind of wrap up with hopefully some more detailed, more kind of closure to the whole thing. Especially we knew today would be a tough day, that we would have things unsettled, and it came just as predicted. So thank you all for your attendance. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your interest. And we hope to see you on the 13th.